What I want to do here is make the case for just intonation and show how it can be used. And let me start by making an observation of something that's kind of amazing. That is, that the most basic harmonies in music correspond to the simplest fractions that can be made with the first few prime numbers, 2, 3, and 5. This is what's captured in just intonation. And this is what's lost in equal temperament. 12-tone equal temperament. It's your standard tuning today. Essentially everything you hear on the radio, wherever, it's an equal temperament. And you know, a lot of great music has been written and performed in equal temperament. It wins out in terms of convenience. Just intonation has some baggage. Not to get ahead of myself here, but as we get into this, we'll see that it really is necessary to be able to tweak the tuning on the fly to make just intonation workable. And that makes things a little bit complicated, but that's not a bad thing. We're humans. We can do complicated. And when just intonation is implemented this way, it really does open the door to the creation of new music, because now we've expanded beyond this finite set of 12 frequencies. And maybe for some musicians, I mean, depending on their instrument, the whole topic of tuning can be below the radar, something for the piano tuner to worry about. But it really is kind of important because, in simplest terms, just intonation has the potential to make music sound better. So I'm going to walk through this, starting with some basics. And if it's too basic, just bear with me. It should get more interesting. And it's a broad topic. I'm not trying to tag every base here, but hopefully cover enough so that this can be useful. And let me also inject this right up front. There's a lot of buzz about so-called AI-created music. I don't dig that at all. I don't even think such a thing exists. And what I'll be talking about here, computers can come into play, but it doesn't relate to AI. I mean, music is created by musicians. It's a reflection of the whole human experience. All artificial intelligence can do is create artificial music, a hodgepodge of whatever happens to be in its training set. All right, back to what we're talking about. In equal temperament, the ratio of the fundamental frequency of any note to that of a note right below it is a fixed value. And that value is 2 raised to the 1/12th power. And that's not an arbitrary number someone dreamed up. It's the value that divides the octave equally into 12 notes and makes the octave ratios 2 to 1. And people can play around with different values of the exponent or the base and come up with variants of equal temperament. But this 2 to the 1/12th expression is standard. And that's the way music and musical instruments are made today. And 2 to the 1/12th is an irrational number. So in equal temperament, the only note whose frequency is not irrational is A. And it's usually set as a whole number, like A440. And the other 11 notes are derived from that. Now, your most fundamental chords in Western music are major and minor triads. And triads, as the name implies, are chords with 3 notes, the root, the third, and the fifth. As in do, mi, so, yeah, those notes. Okay, I'm going to tell my triad story here to give this little context. When I was 15 or 16 playing keyboards in a band, after the dance, a really good-looking girl comes up to me and she says, "Karl, your band sounds great, and you play so well." Well, a friend of mine was standing nearby, and hearing all this adulation, he felt he needed to step in, or I should say cut in. So he's my age, he's a classmate, and he plays trumpet in a jazz quartet, so he knows all about jazz and jazz chords. So he comes up to me, and right in front of her, he says, the dorkiest thing, he says, "How can you accept a compliment from a beautiful woman when you've been sitting there playing triads all night?" In the first place, that wasn't entirely true. And in the second place, so what? Get lost. So some people will look down their nose at music that's comprised mostly of simple triads. And some people will look down their nose at chords, as if that's something for cheaters, fakers, and a terrible way to learn music. But all music has a chordal structure. It's the structure of the music. And it's the frame of reference for every note that occurs. And your most basic chords are major and minor triads. And by the way, believe it or not, that trumpet player and me, we eventually became great friends, playing in the same group. We still keep in touch. All right, triads, the root, the third, and the fifth. So for the sake of simplicity, let's just normalize the frequency of the root to equal 1 hertz. Okay, so your major third is up 4 semitones, so its equal temperament frequency would be 2 to the 4/12ths, or 1.259, etc. Your fifth would be up 7 semitones, so its equal temperament frequency would be 2 to the 7/12ths, or 1.498, whatever. Well, let's take a good look at these values. These are irrational numbers. The decimal places go on forever. This is your major triad in equal temperament. Now, those values happen to be pretty close to these numbers. And these are the intervals used in just intonation. These are rational numbers that can be expressed as fractions: 1, 5/4, and 3/2. Well, you might look at this and say, oh, wow, those are rational numbers and familiar fractions. So what? Why is this important musically? How would this be better than equal temperament? And I kind of think those questions relate to the broader question, what is music in the first place? And how is music different than any other arbitrary sound? Let's do a thought experiment. A humpback whale, he says to his friends, come on, fellas, let's sing a major triad, a cappella. I'll start by singing the root at 1 hertz. Well, no one's going to join in at 1.259, whatever, 1.49. There's nothing to cause the singers to zero in on these irrational numbers defined by equal temperament. They'll converge on the rational values, 5/4 and 3/2, because that's where the notes aren't beating against each other. That's where it's going to be very consonant and sound the best. And I'm not overlooking the fact that, sometimes vibrato or bending notes, that can sound nice. Dissonance itself, flatted fifths, minor seconds. There's a place for all that, but it's downstream from first having established your basic tuning. Well, all right, let's move back up into the human hearing range. This is an F major chord. The equal temperament frequencies are on the top row. Just intonation are shown below. How do they sound? Here's the chord in equal temperament. Here it is in just intonation. Again, equal temperament, just intonation. Now, for the purpose of clarity, I'm using organ tones that don't have a lot of harmonics. And if you're hearing this on YouTube or whatever platform, I hope you can hear the difference. The algorithms they use, the loudness normalization and compression, that all modifies the sound. But here you can see the beatings. Yeah, this is what you just heard. The guy on the top is equal temperament, and the one on the bottom is just intonation. So how far off are the third and the fifth in equal temperament? And when I say off, I mean with respect to just intervals. Well, your fifth is only flat by a couple cents. It's sometimes called a perfect fifth. Your major third's about 14 cents sharp. Your minor third's about 16 cents flat. A cent, of course, is 1/100th of a semitone. So much in music is subjective. There are very few things you can say objectively, this sounds better or worse than that. But at least listening to a chord in isolation, just intonation really does sound better than equal temperament. The trick then is to keep that advantage throughout the musical piece, irrespective of key. And there's the rub. That's always been a problem. And I should point out, this isn't always a day-night difference, because all instruments, including the human voice, they have lots of harmonics. Actually, a series of multiples of your fundamental. So when it all gets added up in a band or an orchestra, the result might not look like that chord I just showed that had no undulation to it at all. And the overall effect, it may be as much a matter of feeling as being consciously aware that, oh, wow, gee, this sounds more in tune than that. So let's dig down, starting with what would be called a fixed just intonation system. Take a look at some of the limitations, and then consider a system that's not fixed. That is to say, as the chords change, the frequencies of notes can be dynamically redefined. As an example, consider the three-chord progression CFG. All right, we'll normalize C major to 1 5/4 and 3/2. Now your F would be a fourth, which is an inverted fifth. So its just interval turns out to be 4/3, and you can get its major third and fifth by multiplying that by 5/4 and 3/2. And we can do the same thing for the G major, right? That's great. Now I can play any CFG three-chord progression in just intonation. But what if there's another chord? Let's say a D minor. Okay, so these are just your white keys, right? The key is C major. And the components of this minor chord we've already just determined. But using those components does not create a minor chord with just intervals. I mean, it's not too far off, but in a more complex chord progression, or if you change the key, you're going to run into dissonance, which is the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. And the point is, you can't just tune an instrument that has fixed tuning to be in just intonation. You can tune it so a few chords work in a specific key, and it breaks down everywhere else. And that's pretty useless. But now assume a system where the tuning is not fixed, but retunable on the fly. It turns out that at any chord change, there are going to be maybe several workable options for redefining frequency. And each one will tweak the song's tuning in a different way. So let's go back to that chord sequence, C, F, G, D minor. And I'm going to plod through this manually. It may seem a bit arduous, but then I'll go back and show how the process can be streamlined. How that would be solved with dynamic tuning would be to build that minor chord with just intervals and do it by retuning as little as possible. It would probably be best not to retune the D that was just used in the previous chord. So keeping its frequency fixed at 9/8, the F and A would get retuned slightly to the new values of 27/20 and 27/16. The less desirable alternative would be to keep the values already established for F and A and lower slightly the value of D to 10/9. And either one of these options would establish just intervals for that minor chord. And the amount of retuning in either case, it's small. It's about 1/5 of a semitone. And by the way, that small interval has a name, syntonic comma. Now, when notes have been used one way and then are redefined to have different frequencies, it creates a noticeable effect, maybe like a microtonal key change, or maybe an unfamiliar sounding chord change. It's a very interesting consequence of dynamic tuning. And the best technique I found for navigating through these options and governing the process of dynamic tuning involves mapping the notes and chords onto a hexagonal grid. And this, by the way, is completely equivalent to a lattice of points called a tonnetz, if you happen to be familiar with that. The notation goes back a long way. Its first use is attributed to the great mathematician Leonhard Euler in 1739. I was surprised to find that out because Euler's famous for a lot of other things. He's a rock star in the world of math. And I've seen different versions of this with the axes pointing in different directions, but here, let's just let the major thirds ascend in this direction, minor thirds in this direction, and fifths in this direction. And these axes, like we talked about, they are the components of major and minor triads. And your triad chords, as well as your more complex chords, they usually can be shown as clusters of cells. Okay, so this is a C major triad, a minor triad, minor third, minor seventh, dominant seventh, major seventh, sixth, ninth, sus, augmented, diminished. And these clusters, as we'll get into, they string together to create a chord progression. So now let's assign frequencies to these notes using just intervals. And I arbitrarily have everything originating from this C, giving it a frequency of 1. And all the cells are shown in the same octave, from 1 to 2 hertz. And all these cells are unique notes. For example, over here there's another C, but its frequency is 648 over 625, and that's a little more than the 1 hertz C over to the left. The different values come into play if the chord progression migrates across the grid. And I'll show how that happens in a bit. And you can see that all the cells in the neighborhood of this C, they have relatively small numerators and denominators. And it's those small values that create this very pure sound of just intonation. And this local neighborhood encompasses all the notes in the chromatic scale. And no matter how it might drift across the grid, it will still always be true that the notes within a local neighborhood are related by fractions with pretty small numerators and denominators. And I should mention at this point that all the values on this hexagonal diagram, they're products of the first 3 prime numbers, 2, 3, and 5, raised to some integer power. It's called 5-limit tuning, or 5-limit just intonation. Now, in terms of implementation, just intonation with dynamic tuning, it's not something you're going to do on a normal fretted instrument or a piano. On the other hand, a string quartet or an a cappella group, they're not constrained by having fixed frequencies assigned to each note. Neither are computers, synthesizers, MIDI guitars, electronic wind instruments. I mean, this is the 21st century. Maybe music shouldn't be constrained by instruments invented before the discovery of electricity. This is a just intonation chord organ. I created it to play chords and construct a progression by clicking the mouse. So let's go back to that CFG D minor sequence, and I'm building that progression with the mouse. And the solutions that we figured out earlier, they're just completely obvious when it's laid out graphically like this. This is the first solution, probably the best solution, where the D minor chord is built upon the D that was just used in the previous G major chord. And here's the other solution we came up with, keeping the previously defined F and A and redefining the D. And here's still another way to do it. So here we have 3 approaches for this 4-chord sequence. We've already said the first one is preferable, but let's go ahead and hear all 3. So the hexagonal grid works really well for visualizing just intonation and showing the options for dynamic tuning. And you can see this being used a couple ways. I mean, having the ability to translate an existing piece from equal temperament to just intonation, but also having the ability to create music directly in just intonation. And let me elaborate on that, because clicking on chords with a mouse, it's not the same visceral experience as holding your guitar and strumming chords and being inspired to write a song. But whatever the human interface, whether it's a mouse or something like an instrument, I think the basic approach of creating music in just intonation with dynamic tuning will eventually supplant equal temperament. I mean, the sound is just so harmonious. And that can't be understated, because pure harmonies, they do sound sweet, but they also resonate deep in the soul as being true and self-validating their right to exist, which is something all art has to do. All right, I'm off in philosophy here, but well, it's like, why do we feel compelled to make lyrics that rhyme? I mean, not all lyrics rhyme, but in general they do. But why not just let lyrics say what they need to say? Well, she was just 17, and the way she looked was incomparable. Doesn't work at all, does it? But the rhyming lyrics are making a statement, and that is, you see, at every level, it all fits together nicely. I've created a little order out of all this chaos. This is added value to human civilization. This little piece of art, albeit a 2-minute pop song, it has a right to exist. And if your mind concurs, it starts releasing endorphins. That's the way it works. And it's the same way with Just Intonation. It all fits together nicely. The notes aren't beating against each other. It's not force-fitted like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that are close, but not really a match. And the other aspect to this is that, yeah, the ability to control pitch beyond this set of 12 tones, it's just another tool in the composer's toolkit. It really is analogous to painting with a palette of 12 colors versus painting with a palette of many, many more colors. As an example, this is a symmetrical looking progression of 32 triads. The song's pitch migrates about 82 cents from one side to the other, but it comes back to where it started because it's a circle. So this whole phenomenon of pitch drift, it's kind of like moving through different time zones. And the farther away you go, the more often you have to adjust your watch. Inversely, if you stay in one place with a simple little 3 or 4 chord progression, you can get by not having to adjust anything. So let's hear this. Firstly is chords, and then we'll flesh it out just a little bit. Well, maybe at first blush, it sounds like random chords. Or maybe it's like looking at the clouds. You know, someone will see a bunny rabbit. Someone else will see a dinosaur. Someone else will look at Mars and see a network of canals and shed a tear for the dying civilization that built those canals. That's the way humans create music, by the way. I played this for a friend who described it as a musical Escher staircase. And I thought that was interesting because I hadn't shown him this circular pattern. So the following is how I began to flesh this out. And this is just organ and bass, but here it comes into focus as something a little more recognizable as music. And this is a top view, but from the side view, you can see the 3D structure where the up axis is time. And what you're seeing now is actually 2 verses that create this helix. And when music is rendered visually in ways like this, you can sometimes see a correspondence between the visual aesthetics and the qualities that make something musical, like resolution. And you might wonder how that might sound in equal temperament. The answer is, it doesn't exist in equal temperament. I mean, it would sound like something not as interesting because, as we've been talking about, equal temperament establishes 12 tones within the octave. And typically your scale is going to use a subset of that. But this little progression uses 30 unique tones just within the chord structure, not counting any off-chord notes. So most of your notes here, they fall in the cracks between the piano keys. And converting this to equal temperament would be like reducing the number of colors in an image, like converting this to this, from Leonardo da Vinci to paint by numbers. So I really hope you found this interesting. You know, people have been writing about tunings for literally thousands of years. And as wise King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. Nevertheless, here we are in the 21st century. And what I've tried to do here is present some ideas in terms of implementation and give a brief example. And you know, in that example, I showed the pitch drift. It doubles back on itself and ends up where it started, but it's also an interesting effect just to let it go wherever it goes. And the other thing I think I mentioned is that all the intervals I've been talking about are products of the first three prime numbers, 2, 3, and 5, raised to some integer power, either positive or negative. It's called 5-limit just intonation. But if you want to throw in some other primes, 7 or 11, you get some very interesting harmonies. For example, that classic barbershop quartet, dominant 7th, that 7th note would typically be an interval of 7/4. But also in that mix, there are a lot of really dark, strained harmonies. I mean, they're still just intervals. Maybe our singing whales would converge to them. But I don't know, they sound very Eastern, maybe Appalachian. There's a lot of room for experimentation. The example I gave is from the album Blessed Be the Gluons That Bind. It's a concept album where all the music is in either 5-limit or 11-limit, just intonation. The album is rock, but it sounds very different. And that link is below. Hey, thank you so much for watching this. So if you found this interesting, go ahead and share it with a friend. Peace.